Step away from that door! You are not a tenant, and this is private property.
Then use your key, because there are 3 people dying on the other side of it. You break that door, I'm calling the police right now. Good. Tell them to send an ambulance and a lot of cold water. That hallway's 120 degrees, and nobody in 3C has answered in an hour. The AC's just old, that's all this is. You don't touch my building! Your AC didn't fail. Somebody shut it off. And your tenants are the ones paying for it.
The door split, and the heat that rolled out was the heat of an oven with the door just cracked, and Otis was already inside. 6 years Otis had carried this route. He knew the 3 people in this apartment, and he saw in 1 second that all 3 were wrong.
Esther! Alma! Bernie Penn! Talk to me, one of you!
Nobody talked. Esther's skin was dry and hot as a stovetop. Alma didn't come up when he said her name, and Bernie was gray.
Bernie! Bernie, look at me!
He put a hand on the old man's chest and felt the thing his hands knew before his mind did. No beat. No, not today, old man. Not while I'm standing here. He dragged Bernie flat, tore the shirt open, and started compressions fast and hard. Somebody get me ice, towels, water, anything cold, go. And you, Mr. Cole, you stand right there and watch what your broken air conditioning did. I'm calling the police right now. This is exactly what I... Good, call them. Tell them a man's heart just stopped inside your building. Between rounds, he poured a pitcher of water down Bernie's chest, because heat was the thing killing him. Come on, Bernie. Your wife is 2 feet away. You do not get to do this to her, not tonight. On the 9th round, the old man's chest heaved, and he pulled a wet, ragged breath. And his eyes cracked open on nothing. There you are. There you are. Otis rolled him onto his side and turned to the couch. Alma, sweetheart, you're next. Hold on for me. Esther, can you hear my voice? There is a version of this that ends here, with a mailman on his knees on a burning floor, 3 people alive because he happened to walk up those stairs. It lasted about as long as the sirens took to arrive. The paramedics came up the stairs 2 at a time and found a scene they could not immediately read. 3 seniors, in various stages of heat collapse, a broken door, water everywhere, and a big man in a postal uniform who had already stripped them down, iced the big vessels at the neck and the groin, and gotten one of them breathing again. The lead medic knelt beside Bernie, read the numbers off her monitor, and went still for a second, the way people go still when a number is worse than they expected. Who did the CPR on this one? I did? Otis didn't look up from Alma. He was down maybe 90 seconds. I got compressions on him fast. Watch his rhythm. He's going to want to throw PVCs. You watch his what? She stared at him. Where do you work? I deliver your mail, Otis said, and moved to the next patient, because there was a 3rd person on that floor, and the question was, a door he did not open for anybody. Nobody died. That should have been the story. 3 people came within a bad hour of dying in a sealed apartment in a heat emergency, and every one of them lived, in large part because the man who read their mailboxes read the danger before anyone else. But Otis knew, kneeling in the water with a stranger's pulse finally ticking under his fingers, that it was already turning into a different story, because 30 feet away, Barrett Cole was talking fast and low into his phone, and the words Otis caught were not "thank God." They were "broke in, and my property, and this man is dangerous." By the time a police officer put a hand on Otis's shoulder, the ground had already shifted. Sir, I need you to step outside and talk to me. Those 3 need transport before you need anything from me. They're being transported. Come on. The officer was young and polite, which was the first bad sign because polite is what people are when they've already decided something. The owner says you forced entry into an occupied unit and destroyed his property. That's breaking and entering. That's criminal mischief. You understand what I'm telling you? Otis looked at the broken door and at the 3 gurneys going down the stairs and at Barrett Cole standing in the hallway wearing an expression of wounded ownership, and he understood exactly what he was being told. He'd been a mailman kicking down a door. That was the whole picture from where the badge was standing. And a picture doesn't care what's true. Check their body temperatures at the hospital, Otis said, quiet. and find out why the cooling in this whole building's been dead for 3 days in a heat warning. Those two things will tell you everything. Neither one of them cares that I'm the one who kicked the door. We'll get to all that. The officer took his arm. Right now you're under arrest. He didn't fight it. He'd learned, a long time ago, in a life nobody on this street knew about, that fighting the current only pulls you under faster, and the thing to do is go still and wait for the water to change. He let them walk him down the stairs of Alder Court, past the neighbors gathering in the hall, and the last thing he saw before the cruiser door closed was Barrett Cole shaking his head at somebody sadly, like a man surveying damage that a stranger had done to something he loved. They released him near midnight, and he walked the 1.5 miles home because his route car was still parked crooked outside the building with the hazards blinking. And he climbed the outside stairs to the second-floor apartment. And Gabe was awake, of course he was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a school laptop open, and his face doing the thing it did lately when he was trying to look like he didn't care. He was 12. He'd gotten tall in the last year and awkward with it, and he had reached the age where his father's job embarrassed him, where a dad who walked the neighborhood in gray shorts putting flyers in mailboxes was the least interesting thing a kid could be saddled with. He didn't know, because Otis had never told him, that the man in the gray shorts had once kept an entire ship's crew alive through a fire at sea. He just knew his dad was a mailman, and now, apparently, his dad had been on the news. It's on people's phones already. Gabe turned the laptop around, a neighbor's shaky video, a big man's back, a splintering door, a landlord's raised hands. This guy's saying you broke into an old lady's apartment. He's saying you're going to jail. Otis set his keys on the counter. On the ring, worn soft with handling, hung a cheap folding paper fan, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $1, and Gabe's eyes went to it the way they always did, and away again, because he'd learned somewhere in his short life that the fan was a door too, and you didn't open it. Some of that's true, Otis said. He was not going to lie to the boy. He'd promised himself that much. I did break a door. There were 3 people inside it dying in the heat, and one of them stopped breathing while I held him, and I got him back. The man who owns that building would rather this be my fault than his, so he's telling a story. And it's going to be loud for a while, and I need you to not read what people write. Can you do that? Gabe looked at the fan, and then at his father with an expression Otis couldn't quite name. Is it going to cost you the job? And that, not the arrest, not the video, not the landlord, was the question that told Otis his son had understood the shape of it faster than he had. Because a felony charge does not just embarrass a federal employee, it ends him. And the mail route was the only thing standing between the two of them and the bottom. I don't know yet, Otis said, which was the truth, and it was the first time in a long time he had not been able to promise his son the ground would hold. The story did what stories do. It got loud, and then it got teeth. Barrett Cole was good on camera. He stood in front of Alder Court in a press shirt and talked, sadly, about the difficulty of being a small landlord these days. About a building he'd inherited from his father and poured his savings into, about an old central cooling unit that had finally given out in the worst possible week, right when he'd already scheduled the repair. And then he talked about a stranger, a postal worker, of all people, a man with no business on the property, who had smashed his way into an occupied apartment and frightened his elderly tenants half to death. He produced a repair invoice for the cameras. He let his voice catch on the word tenants. He was, everyone agreed, a man doing his best in a hard situation, and the mailman was the one who'd made it violent. The district attorney charged Otis with breaking and entering and criminal mischief, and because the door had been an interior unit door and the tenants had not personally called him in, floated the ugliest word available, which was burglary. The Postal Service, which cannot employ a person under felony indictment, put him on unpaid administrative leave the same afternoon, and the letter used the phrase pending resolution. And everyone who has ever received that phrase knows it is a polite way of saying we are already gone. His paycheck stopped. His health insurance started counting down, and the old familiar feeling settled over him again. The feeling of being quietly reshaped into whatever the story needed him to be, right on schedule. He didn't just sit under it. He tried. He went downtown to the city housing office and sat across a metal desk from a code investigator named Margot Whitfield, A tired woman in her 50s with a stack of files that never got shorter, and he told her what he knew. That chiller didn't fail. Somebody shut it off, before the heat wave, on purpose. I've worked marine systems my whole life. You don't get a building this cold dead from an old unit dying size. You get it from a hand on a valve. He leaned in. He's cooking those people out to sell the place empty. That's the whole thing. Whitfield listened, and she didn't disagree. And that was almost the worst part. Mr. Calloway, I have a file on Alder Court a mile thick. Complaints going back 2 years, heat, locks, notices. She tapped it. You know what I don't have? One single piece of paper that proves intent. A broken machine is a code violation, a fine, a slap. A machine somebody turned off on purpose to hurt tenants. That's a crime. And crimes need proof a court can hold. Right now, all I've got is a landlord who says his AC broke and a mailman under indictment who says it didn't. She wasn't unkind about it. She was just accurate. Get me somebody who was in that basement. Get me somebody who watched him do it or was told to leave it off and is willing to put their name on it. Then I can end him. Until then, I've got a fat file and no floor to stand on, same as you. So he needed a witness, and every person who could be one was somebody the fear had already gotten to. Gabe got it at school in a day and a half. He came home with a torn backpack strap and a look that dared his father to ask, and Otis got the shape of it out of him sideways over dishes. The way you get anything out of a 12-year-old. A kid said his mom saw the video, said you're a burglar who beats up old people. Gabe scrubbed a plate that was already clean. I told him he was too dumb to know the difference between a burglar and a guy who kicks a door to save somebody. He got mad. It got physical. You okay? I'm fine. He's fine. He set the plate down. Are we going to be okay? Like money. I'm not a baby, Dad. I can do the math on us. And Otis, who had spent this boy's whole life making sure he never had to do that particular math, took the plate out of his hands and did the thing he always did with anyone who was scared, which was to crouch down until his eyes were below theirs, a trick from a life Gabe didn't know he'd had. We're going to be okay, he said. I don't know how yet, but I have never once let us hit the bottom, and I am not starting now. I need you to trust me on the part I can't explain yet. You always say there's a part you can't explain yet. Gabe's voice cracked 1 degree and steadied. About everything. That landed somewhere Otis wasn't ready for, and he didn't answer it. And the boy let him not answer, and the two of them finished the dishes in the kind of silence that has a whole history folded up inside it. Because Gabe was right. There was always a part Otis couldn't explain, and fighting Barrett Cole the way his court-appointed lawyer wanted him to fight, loudly, publicly, with his own face and his own story out in front, meant finally opening the part. It meant explaining why a mailman knew, at a glance, that 3 old people in a hot apartment were minutes from dying. It meant explaining why he kept ice packs and a case of water in his route car all summer. It meant explaining the fan on his keyring and the name he never said, and the reason he had walked away from a career at sea to carry the mail on foot through the same 40 blocks every single day, present on the ground, where he could see people. It meant Cyrus. His father had been a merchant seaman too, and then a retired one, living alone in a 3rd-floor walk-up 2 states away, in a building not so different from Alder Court, with a window unit that wheezed and a landlord who took his time. Cyrus had been the kind of man who didn't complain, and didn't call, and didn't want to be a bother to anyone. And one August, while Otis was far out at sea, a heat wave settled over his father's city and didn't move. By the time a neighbor thought to knock, the old man had been gone 2 days, in his chair, by a window that didn't open all the way, in a room that had become an oven so slowly he probably never understood what was killing him. He had kept a whole crew alive through a fire at sea, and he had not been able to do the one thing his own father needed, which was for somebody to knock. When he finally got home and buried the man, he made a decision that cost him the career and eventually a marriage that could not hold together across the grief and the guilt. He came ashore for good. He took the smallest, most present job he could find. He put on the gray shorts, learned every old person on the route by name, and every summer did quietly for strangers. The one thing he had failed to do for his own father. He knocked. He had never told Gabe any of it. He'd told himself the not telling was to protect the boy. Standing in his kitchen with a felony charge and a dead paycheck, he understood, the way you understand a thing you've been refusing to look at, that the not telling had mostly been to protect himself. So when the world handed him a fight, he flinched, because the fight had a shape he knew, a man being asked to prove he had not failed the people who depended on him. He had lost that fight once, and it had taken everything. And some animal part of him believed that if he stayed quiet and small, it might not take Gabe too. The person who wouldn't let him stay quiet and small was an 81-year-old man in a hospital bed. Otis went to see them, all three, because they were his, and he needed to see with his own eyes that they were still breathing. Esther waved him off like he was fussing. Alma cried and held his hand and called him the mailman angel until he had to look at the ceiling. And Bernie, propped up and gray around the edges, but arguing with a Jell-O cup, fixed Otis with a look that had 80 years of not being fooled behind it. "They're saying you're the criminal." Bernie's voice was a rasp. "In my own building." The man turns off the cool air in a heat wave. My heart stops on my own living room floor. And they arrest. "Don't get worked up. It's bad for the thing that just stopped. Sit down." It was not a request. Otis sat. Bernie studied him for a long moment, the quiet steadiness of a man who has watched a lot of people decide too slowly. "A mailman doesn't do what you did to me. I've been alive 81 years, son. I know a trained man's hands when they're on my chest. So I'm going to ask you one time, and then I'll leave it alone." He leaned forward an inch. "Who taught you to bring a man back like that? And why does it look like it hurts you to do it?" And Otis Calloway, sitting at the bedside of a man he had pulled back from the dead, found that this was a door he could, at last, open a crack. Not for a jury, not for a camera, but for one old man who had asked the right question in the right voice. "His name was Cyrus," Otis said. "My father, he was a seaman like me. He got old and lived alone, 2 states off, in a building a lot like this one." He turned the paper fan over in his hands. One August, it got hot and stayed hot. He was the kind of man who didn't call anybody, didn't want to be a bother. Same as you, Bernie. Same exact kind. Bernie didn't say anything. He just watched and let the younger man find the next part. I was 11 days out of port. Chief engineer, middle of the Atlantic. They came and got me on the satellite phone down in the engine room, and I stood there with the machinery running and the ship doing 14 knots. My father had already been gone 2 days in a hot room, and there was nothing on this earth I could do about it. His voice was flat and level, the way a man keeps it when level is the only thing holding him up. He needed one person to knock on his door. I was that person, and I was in the middle of the ocean. "So you came ashore?" Bernie said quietly. "I came ashore, took the mail. Been knocking on doors ever since." Otis looked down at his hands. Yours was the door this time. It was the first time he had said his father's name out loud since that satellite phone rang in the engine room, and something in his chest, wound tight for 11 years, gave a quarter turn and let a little air in. The truth, when it started to move, did not come from a machine. It came from the people the machine had been ignoring. It started small, the way these things do. A woman from the 2nd floor of Alder Court stopped a local reporter who'd come sniffing for a landlord versus lunatic angle and told him he had it backwards. She said the mailman was the only person who ever checked on the old folks in that building. She said he brought Mr. Abernathy a box fan out of his own pocket when the man's window unit died. She said everybody on the route knew that if you were old and alone and it got hot, Otis Calloway would knock on your door with a cold bottle of water and sit with you for 10 minutes every day, and that he'd been doing it for years and nobody had ever asked him to. The reporter, who had come for one story, went home with the beginning of a very different one. Gabe found that story online before his father got home and read it 3 times, and then sat very still at the kitchen table. He had spent a whole year being embarrassed by a man in gray shorts. And here were strangers, old people he had never met, telling a reporter that the man in gray shorts had been quietly keeping them alive for years. that he bought box fans out of his own thin paycheck, that he sat with a dying woman on her last afternoon because her kids lived 3 states away and somebody should be there. Things his father had never once mentioned at dinner. Things his father did every single day on the exact route Gabe had rolled his eyes at. Otis came home to find the boy waiting up, without his usual armor on. Is it true? The stuff those people said, the fans, sitting with the lady who died. Where'd you see that? It's everywhere now, Dad. People are sharing it. Gabe swallowed. You never told me you do any of that? It's not a thing you tell people. Otis set down his bag. It's a thing you do. Why, though? Why do you do it? And Otis looked at his son and at the fan on the key ring, and for 1 second he almost said the whole of it. Then he didn't. Because some doors you only get to open once, and it wasn't the right night. It's just something a person ought to do, he said. That's all it is. Gabe let him have that. But something in the boy had cracked open, and under the embarrassment was a thing that looked, for the first time, a lot like pride. And neither of them knew yet what it was going to grow into. And a young repair technician named Kip Farrow watched the news in his apartment with a knot in his stomach because Kip knew a thing that nobody was saying. 3 weeks earlier, before the heat wave, Barrett Cole had called Kip's shop out to Alder Court about the central cooling. Kip had gone down into the basement, opened the mechanical room, and found a chiller that was, by the standards of a 50-year-old machine, perfectly fine. It wasn't broken. It had been shut down. The isolation valves hand-cranked closed, the main breaker pulled and taped. Somebody had turned it off on purpose. Kip had flipped the breaker back and started to open the valves, and Cole had stopped him. Leave it, Cole said. Building's getting sold. No point spending money to cool it now. Tenants are on their way out anyway. And Kip, who was 34 and behind on his truck payment and did a lot of work for Cole's properties, had shrugged and left it, and written up a work order that said in his own careful hand exactly what he'd found, and exactly what he'd been told. He'd filed it and tried to forget it. Now an 81-year-old man had flatlined on a living room floor, and a mailman was being called a burglar, and Kip Farrow had a piece of paper in a folder that could end all of it, and he could not make himself pick up the phone. Because picking up the phone meant Cole's lawyers, and Cole's lawyers meant no more work orders. And no more work orders meant the truck and the apartment and the whole thin scaffolding of a life a paycheck away from the ground. He knew the shape of the fear exactly. It was the same fear that had a whole building of old people not saying what they'd watched their landlord do for months. Because there was more than Kip. There was Esther. Otis found out about the notebook by accident, sitting with her in the day room of the rehab wing while she did the crossword and pretended she wasn't glad of the company. She'd been through this before, she told him, not looking up. Another building, another city, 30 years ago. A landlord who wanted the rent-stabilized tenants gone and figured out that you didn't have to evict people if you could just make a building unlivable. Until they left on their own. Cold radiators in January. Then later, no cool air in July. Broken locks that never got fixed. It had a name, she said. The lawyers called it constructive eviction. The tenants called it being cooked out. She'd lost her apartment that way once, and she'd promised herself never again, so this time, at Alder Court, she'd kept a book. She took it out of her bag and showed him. Every date the cooling went off. Every eviction notice slid under a door. Every time Cole had stood in the lobby and told a frightened old person that the building was changing, and maybe they'd be happier somewhere with an elevator. Dates, times. Her small, precise handwriting, page after page, a year of a man's quiet cruelty documented by the one tenant too stubborn to look away. That's it, Otis said quietly. Esther, that book is the whole thing. You take that to the investigator, and it's over. And then what? She closed the notebook and held it in her lap with both hands. Then, I'm the old woman who testified against her landlord, in her landlord's building, where I still have to sleep every night until a court that takes 2 years says otherwise. I've done this before, Otis. You know what happens to the ones who speak up first? Everything. Everything happens to them. She looked at him, and there was no shame in it, only the flat arithmetic of the old and the poor. I'm 78, I don't have another building in me. I'm sorry. So there it was. 2 witnesses, a work order, and a notebook. Everything anyone needed to prove it that Barrett Cole had turned a building of old people into an oven on purpose, held in the hands of 2 people the fear had gotten to first. And Otis Calloway understood that fear better than anyone, because he had it too. He had a son and a felony charge, and one wrong move away from losing the boy the way he'd lost everything else. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to keep his head down and let his lawyer work the door and hope the temperatures at the hospital were enough. He might have done the smart thing. He was, God help him, tired enough to do the smart thing. Then Barrett Cole's lawyers got him a restraining order. It was framed as protection for the frightened tenants and the damaged property, and it was, on paper, entirely reasonable. And it meant that Otis Calloway was now legally forbidden to come within 500 feet of Alder Court. Setting 1 foot on that property would be a new crime, a violation of a court order, the surest possible way to hand the district attorney the reckless, dangerous man the story needed. It was a clean, quiet, lawyerly move, and it did exactly what it was built to do. It put a wall between the old people and the only person who ever came when it got hot. And then, that same week, the Weather Service put out the alert that Otis had been dreading since the first day the pavement got soft. The heat dome wasn't breaking. It was building to a peak. The grid was overloaded, and the power company announced rolling blackouts, starting that night to keep the whole system from collapsing, which meant that after dark, in the worst heat of the worst week, the lights, the fans, and whatever thin cooling anyone had left were going to go off, neighborhood by neighborhood, for hours at a time. Alder Court was on the list. Esther was already back there. So were Bernie and Alma, sent home from the hospital. Because a hospital bed is a thing insurance stops paying for the moment you can sit up home to a 4th-floor apartment in a building with the cooling still valved shut. In a heat wave. On a night the power was scheduled to die. Otis sat in his kitchen and watched the clock, and he did the math a man does when the smart thing and the right thing have finally, completely parted ways. If he stayed home, he kept his shot at beating the charge. He kept the possibility of the job, the paycheck, the health insurance, the roof, the boy. He did the responsible thing, the thing a good father is supposed to do, which is not throw away the last floor under his own child to run towards somebody else's crisis. If he stayed home and the lights went out over Alder Court, and 3 or 4 or 6 old people who had no one cooked slowly in the dark the way his father had, well, he would have been being responsible. He would have been protecting his own. It was, by every reasonable measure, the correct choice. He put on his shoes. Where are you going? Gabe was in the hall doorway, and he already knew, the way kids know. You remember I told you there's a part I can't explain? Otis crouched down to the boy's eye level one more time. I'm going to explain it now, and it's going to sound crazy. And I need you to hear all of it. A long time ago, my dad, your grandfather, died alone in a hot room because I was too far away to knock on his door. That's the part I never told you. That's the fan. That's the whole thing. And tonight the lights are going out over a building full of people just like him. And there's a court paper that says if I go help them, I lose everything. Maybe including you. He held his son's face for a second. I'm going anyway, because I already know what it costs to be the man who didn't come. And I would rather lose everything than teach you that you can watch that happen and call it being careful. Lock the door. Don't open it for anybody but me. He was out the door before the boy could answer, which was a mercy for both of them. The blackout hit Alder Court at 9:40. The building went dark all at once. The hum of 100 window units dying together, the stairwell lights blinking out, the emergency exit signs fading to nothing, and in the sudden silence you could hear it start. The low collective groan of a brick building full of stored heat with nothing left to move the air. It was already 91 degrees inside at 9:40. In 2 hours, on the top floors, it would be a killing box. Otis crossed the 500 feet he was forbidden to cross, and he did not slow down, and he did not look for a camera, and there was no version of this where it wasn't a crime. He went up. He had a flashlight from his route bag, and the plan of a man who had run casualty drills in the dark on a rolling ship, and he worked it floor by floor the way you work a scene. When there are more people than there is time, he got Esther first, because she was closest, and because she was the kind of proud that would sit alone in the dark, insisting she was fine, until she wasn't. I can manage on my own. I'm not helpless. She said it, and then her knees said something different, and she caught his arm. You shouldn't be here, Otis. They'll put you in a cell for this. You know that. Let them. Arms around my neck, we're going down slow. You are the most stubborn man I have met in 78 years. Learned it off a route full of stubborn old people. Hush and hold on. He got the Brennans on 3, and old Mr. Abernathy with his dead box fan, and a woman on 2 whose name he didn't know yet, and he moved them down the black stairwell one at a time and out into the marginally cooler night air of the courtyard, and he went back up and up and up, on a route he'd walked 10,000 times, in the dark, in a heat that took the strength out of a strong man in minutes. Bernie and Alma were last, on 4, because 4 is the worst, and because Bernie could not do stairs anymore. Otis found the old man half-conscious in his chair by the window that didn't open all the way, and for one terrible second the room and the chair and the heat were another room and another chair 2 states and 11 years away, and Otis had to breathe through it. Then Bernie's eyes cracked open and found him. You're not supposed to be here, the old man rasped. They'll take everything. I know exactly what they'll take. Otis got an arm under him. Hold on to my neck. You're going for a ride, and your wife is going first, so don't argue. There isn't time to argue. He carried Alma down 4 flights in the dark. Then he went back up and carried Bernie, 130 pounds of stubborn old sailor, down the same 4 flights. And by the bottom, Otis's legs were shaking, and his own heart was pounding out warnings, and he did not stop because you do not stop. Because there had been a clock once that he could not read in time, and he had spent 11 years and a whole life learning to read this one. He didn't do it alone at the end. That was the thing he would remember. Somewhere on the 3rd trip, a young man he half recognized appeared in the dark stairwell and got under the other side of a heavy old woman without being asked. And it was Kip Farrow. He had seen Alder Court on the rolling blackout list that evening and known exactly what a night without power would do to a building he'd left valved shut. And he had not been able to sit in his apartment with that knowledge, so he'd driven over with the work order finally in his jacket pocket, half meaning to give it to somebody, not knowing to whom. He had found instead a mailman, carrying the elderly out of a black building he was under a court order to stay away from. And he had parked his truck and started climbing stairs, because there are some things a person cannot watch and go on being who they were before they watched it. By the time the fire trucks and the second wave of ambulances arrived, there were 11 elderly residents of Alder Court sitting in the courtyard in the dark, alive, being handed water, and a mailman on his knees on the pavement with nothing left in his legs, and a repair technician standing next to him shaking, and an officer walking toward all of them with a complicated expression because a restraining order had very clearly been violated, and it was very clearly the least important thing that had happened that night. He broke the order, someone from the property management side was already saying. You saw it, officer. He came right onto the... I turned it off. Kip Farrow said it too loud, into the dark, before he could talk himself out of it, and then he said it again, steadier. The cooling. I didn't... Cole told me to leave it off, 3 weeks ago. It wasn't broken. He shut it down on purpose and told me to leave it, and I have the work order. I wrote it all down. It's in my truck. He was crying now, a little, the ugly, relieved way. I've been sitting on it for 3 weeks. An old man's heart stopped on his own floor, and this guy's the one you people were going to put in jail. And Esther, 78 years old, sitting on a courtyard bench with a wet towel on her neck and her whole body still shaking from the heat, watched the man who had just carried her down 4 black flights kneel on the pavement and lose everything to do it. And something in her that had been afraid for 30 years, through 2 cities and 2 buildings and a whole life of learning to look away, finally, quietly, ran out. I have a notebook, Esther said. She was not loud. She didn't need to be. A year of it. Every date he shut the cooling off, every notice, everything that man did. She looked at Otis on the pavement. I was too scared to use it. I'm not anymore. Come talk to me, officer. I'll tell you all of it, and I'll say it in a courtroom, and I'll say it with my name. Otis got home a little before dawn. He had not been arrested. He climbed the outside stairs expecting a dark, sleeping apartment, and found instead every light burning. His own block had kept its power through the night. And Gabe, at the kitchen window, where he had apparently been for hours, phone in his hand. The boy had been tracking the blackout map and a neighbor's shaky live stream from the Alder Court courtyard, watching his father carry old people out of the dark one at a time, and not knowing, the whole while, whether the next thing he'd see was that father in handcuffs. Gabe didn't say anything clever when Otis came in. He just crossed the kitchen and put his arms around his father's middle, the way he hadn't since he was small, and held on. And Otis stood in the doorway, smelling of smoke and other people's sweat, and held the boy back, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. After that, it stopped being about a mailman. Margot Whitfield's 3-inch file on Alder Court had been missing exactly one thing: proof of intent. And Kip's work order and Esther's notebook were the two halves of it. A chiller shut down by hand weeks before the heat on the owner's explicit instruction, dates that matched the eviction notices, and a purchase agreement subpoenaed from a development company that paid Barrett Cole a great deal more for the building delivered empty than delivered full. The picture assembled itself. The charges against Otis Calloway were dropped inside a week. The restraining order violation, the night he had crossed the 500 feet, which was a real crime and everyone knew it, sat on the district attorney's desk for exactly as long as it took her to read the fire department's report on how many people had come out of that building alive. She declined to bring it. A judge vacated the order the same week on the plain grounds that the tenants it was written to protect had spent a blackout being carried down 4 dark flights by the man it was written to keep away. It was not mercy, exactly. It was a system remembering for once, and only because the facts were finally loud enough. What it was built for. Barrett Cole was charged with a stack of the things that would take a year to work through a court: reckless endangerment, filing a false report, and the one that mattered, the one with the ugly true name: unlawful eviction by rendering a dwelling uninhabitable. It would not go quickly, and it would not be clean. When Whitfield finally laid it all out in front of him, the work order, the notebook, the purchase agreement, side by side, Barrett Cole didn't rage. He went quiet, and then he said the thing that explained the whole of it. It's a 50-year-old building. He said it to the table, not to her. You run central cooling for 11 people paying rents from 1990. You go broke. You lose everything your father spent his life on. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He turned his hands over, looking at them. The unit was old. It was going to fail eventually anyway. I just didn't fix it when it did. When an old man's heart stopped on his own floor, Mr. Cole. I know that. And for a second something moved behind his face, and then it closed again. But I didn't turn off his heart. I turned off a machine. That was the whole horror of it. And Otis, when he heard about it later, understood it better than he wanted to. Cole had said that sentence to himself so many nights that he could nearly say it out loud and believe it. Nearly. He was not a monster. That was the frightening part. He was an ordinary man who had done the arithmetic of other people's lives one too many times and had misplaced, somewhere in the columns, the part where they were people. The Postal Service quietly put Otis back on his route, and the letter this time used the word reinstated and did not apologize. And that was fine, because he had never done any of it for them. He went to see Bernie one more time before the old man went to stay with a niece who'd finally been shamed into having a spare room. Bernie was in a chair by an open window with actual moving air coming through it, and he watched Otis come in and sit down. And for a while neither of them said anything, which between the two of them had become its own kind of talk. You threw away your whole case for us, Bernie said finally, that night. You knew what it would cost, and you came up those stairs anyway. He shook his head slowly. Your father would have... Don't. Otis's voice wasn't sharp. It was just tired. Please. I know what you're going to say. And it's a kind thing, and I can't carry it. You're going to carry it, whether I say it or not. So you might as well hear it right. Bernie reached over with a hand that still shook and put it flat on Otis's forearm. over the old burn scar he didn't know the story of. You think you failed your dad because you weren't there when it got hot? I'm going to tell you something, son. From the inside of it, I was that man. I was dying in that chair by that window, slow, for God knows how long. And my Alma was going with me, and the whole world walked past our door, and nobody came. His grip tightened. And then somebody came. A mailman kicked my door in and put his hands on my chest and would not let me go. You didn't fail your father, Otis. You've been finding him, one door at a time, on every route they ever handed you for 11 years. And the day it counted, you came. For us. You were there. His eyes were wet and steady. Some things you don't get to fix. But you came. Let that be the true thing. Otis Calloway put his face down for a moment, and the old man left his hand where it was, and neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything else, and both of them knew it. Some weeks later, on the first genuinely warm afternoon of a new stretch of heat, Otis walked his route the way he always had, and for the first time in 6 years, he had company. Gabe had asked to come, not been made to, asked. He'd found the fan on the keyring one night and made his father tell him the rest of it, all of it. Cyrus and the ship and the 11 days. And something in the telling had rearranged the boy the way the truth rearranges you at 12. And now he walked the 40 blocks in the heat with a backpack full of cold water bottles from the case in the route car, and he did not think his father's job was boring anymore. They came up on the corner where old Mrs. Kowalski lived alone on a second floor, and Otis stopped, the way he stopped every hot day, and looked up at her window. The curtain was still. The fan he'd given her last summer turned lazily behind the glass. How do you know which doors? Gabe asked. You don't, always. Otis handed him a water bottle. Heat takes the quiet ones. The ones who don't call, don't complain, don't want to be a bother. So you don't wait to be sure. Somebody just has to knock. Somebody just has to... Gabe looked at the bottle, and at the window, and at his father, and then he climbed the 2 steps to the door and knocked and waited, the way you wait for someone you have decided to be responsible for. The curtain moved, and an old woman's voice, thin and glad, and a little surprised, called out that she was coming. She was coming. Just give an old lady a minute. Otis Calloway stood on the sidewalk in the heat and watched his son hold the door for a stranger and did not say anything at all.